Hi, I'm Kat. My mentor is Therese, and I'll be reading an excerpt from a novel called Halflings. The idea came from when I was talking with one of my friends, and you have all those folk tales about, like, human falls in love with insert animal or magical creature here. So I was thinking, like, okay, if they're sleeping together, are they gonna have kids? What's going on? So anyway, Terry's mother is an elf, and Mika's is a mermaid, and the rest is kind of self-explanatory. So. He'd been lying on his back in the dark, half listening to Tchaikovsky, his laptop mumbling softly to itself as he worked up the energy to put on his gloves and finish his homework. If someone asked him now, he wouldn't be able to tell them what he'd been thinking about exactly. Maybe trying to remember the details of his childhood, or maybe thinking about the way Mika looked when she laughed in the sunlight. The light had begun to creep in through the drapes in that awkwardly brilliant moment between daylight and twilight when the sky looks blue, but the light sets everything in its path on fire, and the sunbeam's Midas touch turns the world to gold, and in the soft stillness of that half-awake state of silent contemplation and willing himself to work, Mika screamed from the downstairs bathroom and shattered every glass-like object within 10 feet of her. When he burst into the small, tiled room, she was sitting curled up on the seat of the toilet, large eyes wet and wide. The floor was glittering with shards of mirrors and the glasses they used to rinse their mouths out at night, splattered with the purplish mix of Mermish human blood, like a Pollock. And it wasn't until he looked from the floor to her and back again that he could see that she was holding her hands out in front of her, as though they were diseased. "What? Mika?" he'd murmured, brows furrowed, but she only had eyes for her fingers. And there, between the base of each pale digit, a thin layer of translucent skin had begun to form, pink and wet and raw. "I dreamt my hands were burning," she whispered, and Terry shivered at her words. "I dreamt that they were burning, and when I woke up, my fingers were stuck together, and they hurt, and when I washed my hands, they wouldn't come apart, and—" "You're turning," he said quietly, and she looked up at him with a furious expression, tears streaming from her face, and shouted no, repeated it over and over again until he walked across the glass-littered floor and carried her out, let her clutch his t-shirt and stain it with tears. He made her chamomile tea and cleaned the blood and scratches on her face, her feet, and when he finished bandaging both of them in silence, he cleaned the blood from the floors and the glass from the bathroom. He scrubbed the hall carpeting until the red came out of the soft fibers, took out the garbage and turned off the laptop, and when he returned to the living room, he found her curled up on the couch, watching him with red eyes. There was a long silence. When he moved to sit next to her on the couch, she pulled away and curled up on the other side, nursing her tea in silence, watching. A few moments passed before either spoke, and in the interim, Terry had taken the time to memorize every feature. The red-rimmed eyes, the sleek black hair, the fae in her made her look part Asian, her large eyes slightly upturned, hair rod straight. But her skin was too pale, limbs too long and fine-boned, and when she smiled, it wasn't Caucasian or Asian, just strange. The stretch too wide, the teeth too sharp, the eyes too large in the expression. 2 months before, she'd made a little girl cry, and Terry was sorry for laughing. She tried not to smile as much anymore. "Are you ever going to say anything?" he asked, finally, and when she didn't respond, he turned to leave. Her hand caught his wrist, the sharp nails digging into the flesh. "Stay." Terry sat down again and waited. "I hate the ocean," she said finally, and he smiled softly at her. "I know." She wasn't listening. "I hate it. It's all salty and gross. I hate salt. It tastes awful, and I'd have to swim in it all the time, or I'd get sick, and I don't like sharks. I know that they listen to Mom, and she loves them, or whatever, but they're ugly and scary and nasty, and they eat fish. And I'd have to eat fish, and I like fish. They're kind of dumb, of course, but they're nice, and I don't want to eat them. I'd have to eat fish and octopuses, which are gross. It's octopi. And anyway, they're really smart, and they don't deserve to get eaten, although they're kind of obnoxious and not very nice, but still. And I don't like manta rays or stingrays or whatever. They're creepy, and they remind me of bats." Mika paused. "And I don't like salt." Terry's lips twitched as he watched her. She was playing with the hem of the shirt he'd handed her to replace the one covered in blood, her fingers ripping the material under her hands. Her knuckles were slowly turning white, and he tried to map out the exact furrow in her brow as he watched her fuss with the cloth, wrinkling and unwrinkling it in her agitation. Finally, he caught her hands in his. "Mika, look at me." Terry waited until she did. "You don't have to go back to your mother. It'll be fine, all right? I promise. We have a while to figure things out. It'll be okay." Mika smiled bitterly. It was an expression that Terry would become very familiar with, but at that moment it seemed to sit oddly on her face. He paused at the acridity burning through the typical fresh fierceness. "Says you," she muttered softly. "Nothing will ever be okay again." "Don't be so dramatic. Of course it will," he said, smiling. The expression was notably forced. No, Terry had never truly doubted his sanity, but looking back, perhaps he should have, because Mika was always right, and he was full of shit, and nothing was ever okay again.